Good evening. We're so sorry about the technical issues that we are having. I'm Jen Rothenberg, the Director of Arlington Community Education, and I am happy to welcome you tonight to our We Need to Talk Fall Series with Steve Almond. Tonight we will discuss how the new cannabis dispensary came to town. We'll learn what goes on behind those frosted windows, and we'll talk about how to have a conversation with your children about the dispensary, and maybe even about your own use. This series was created to encourage conversation about difficult topics, but because we aren't able to be in person tonight, we need to ask you to go that extra step of writing in your comments and questions. Steve will read them and bring them to the table for discussion. The evening will be much more lively and informative with your participation, so please do join in. To participate, you can type your questions into the live chat feature, which is directly to the right of the video on your screen. If you don't have a Gmail account, just look for the little button to create a channel so you can join the chat and enter your questions that way. We have a great evening planned. So let me tell you a little bit about our host, Steve Almond. Steve is the author of 11 books of fiction and nonfiction, including the New York Times bestsellers, Candy Freak and Against Football. His stories and essays have appeared in all kinds of places. They've been in the Best American Short Stories and even in the New York Times Magazine. Steve was also the co-host of the popular Dear Sugars podcast with Cheryl Strayed, which is a personal favorite of mine. And Steve happens to live right here in Arlington with his wife, Erin Almond, who's also a novelist, and they have 3 kids. We are so pleased to have him with us tonight. So welcome, Steve.
Good to be with everybody. I know this is weird. We're all in our separate boxes, but please take to heart what Jen said. This is intended to be a conversation. We've got 3 fantastic panelists who have a lot of wisdom and knowledge to offer. But what's gonna make it all work the best is if you guys are really generous and forthcoming with your questions, your comments, your concerns, your complaints, your quibbles, whatever it is. We are here to hear it and process it. And I just want to introduce our incredible panelists. Let me reemphasize also just quickly what Jen was saying. This is really, dispensaries in Arlington are a done deal. We'll soon have more than one in Arlington. And we're not going to really talk, Erin will speak to, one of our panelists will be speaking to the planning process, but we're not going to be talking about whether they should or shouldn't be approved. The bong is out of the barn on that one, I think. Our focus is really going to be on helping people understand what goes on in and around the dispensary and soon dispensaries and how the dispensaries fit into our community. We'll have a balanced conversation. That's why we've opted to have experts sort of with various perspectives and maybe different opinions, but we want to have a conversation that's factual and not an argument. That's really not the same thing as a conversation. It's going to be focused on educating the public. That's us. So I want to introduce our fantastic panelists, and they will pop up into your life here momentarily. Erin Zwirko is currently the Assistant Director for Planning and Community Development for the town of Arlington, where she worked with the town's marijuana study group. I am impressed and astonished that there is such a thing as a marijuana study group. Long in the past, I was part of a marijuana study group, but a different sort of marijuana study group. Anyway, she's worked with the town's marijuana study group to develop zoning regulations related to adult use marijuana. She also helped review applications submitted for a host community agreement from the town and provided staff support to the Arlington Redevelopment Board in its review of special permits for dispensaries. She is an expert. In addition to this, she contributes to a variety of efforts related to implementation of the master plan and housing production plan. Welcome, Erin.
Thank you.
All right, awesome. Cindy Sheridan, Curran, is the diversion. Cindy does a lot of things, so don't mess with her. Here are among the things that she does. She is the diversion court / home liaison, attendance officer, and readiness emergency management coordinator for the Arlington Public Schools. Many of you taking part in this conversation already know Cindy and her work, I'm sure of it. She has a wide variety of experience working with at-risk youth. She presently supports students and families through her position and roles as the attendance officer and homeless liaison and foster care point of contact. In addition, Cindy has served as the Arlington Youth Court Diversion Coordinator for the last 14 years and the facilitator for guiding good choices and evidence-based curriculum to help parents guide children toward healthy decision-making. Please welcome Cindy. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
All right. And last but not least, this is Dianna Dixon. She is a consultant and educator on medical and adult use cannabis. She trained as a homeopath in London, returning to Arlington 20 years ago to raise her daughter. For 18 months, Dianna advised patients and clients about cannabis at what is currently the largest and busiest dispensary in the entire country, which is in Brookline. She's talked to hundreds of people about this effective natural medicine and continues to do so at a local dispensary, our local dispensary. Welcome, Dianna.
Thank you.
All right, so I want to ask each of these experts a very basic question just to get us started. And then, like Jen and I have been saying, we are counting on all of you stoners and non-stoners to contribute questions through the various streams that you have on your boxes in your houses. I'm going to start with Cindy, and I'm going to ask this question both as the parent of a couple of teenagers and an occasional user of cannabis. And by occasional, I mean as often as I can and not nearly as often as I would like, maybe once every couple of weeks. Cindy, I want to ask you actually a couple of things. Do you see parental use as a gateway to child use or teen use of cannabis? And if you're in the position like I am, an occasional cannabis user, what's the best way to initiate a conversation or conversations with a teenager if you're their parent?
So I think modeling behavior has a huge impact on the things that our children do and the things and kind of some of the beliefs that they form. So I think when you're a parent, whether it's smoking marijuana or whether it's drinking alcohol or doing something else that you would find would be not healthy for them where they are in life to do, it's really important to have that conversation and to be really honest and clear about what your beliefs are about it. And then really guide them to thinking about why it's different for adults to do some things than it is for children to do others. But I think most importantly is just really taking advantage of the bond you have with your children and having dialogue with them, not sitting down and lecturing them and throwing facts and information at them, really kind of engaging them in the conversation while you're trying to guide them along to what your kind of beliefs are, and as well as your expectations of their behavior.
Okay, I love that. And I want to just ask a quick clarifying question. I think, I guess it's genuinely something I puzzle over. I think what you're saying actually, should I be hiding my use? Or, I mean, obviously, maybe this is a dopey question, but I sometimes wonder, is this something I should, do I need to sort of tuck it away and make sure they don't have any inkling about it? And that's the best way to model, or should I be, without being blatant about it, upfront with them if they bring it up?
Well, when you're talking about current use, I think when you're all in the same household, to cover it up is kind of tough because kids get it. They understand what's going on. And so they're going to want to connect with you and understand what's happening. You don't want to kind of leave them to try to figure out what the difference is between your expectations of their behavior and what your own kind of habits are. So I think it's important to, again, engage them in honest conversation about, what you're doing, why you're doing it. The one thing that I always caution parents is that access is huge. It has an enormous impact on the risk that children take with substances. And so in terms of access in your home, that's one area that you would absolutely want to, be careful and hide it and tuck it away.
Check. Okay, awesome. Thank you. Erin, I want to ask you, we were talking about a little bit before we got on the stream that Arlington was, when I moved here in 2006, a dry town. It used to be a dry town, didn't have liquor stores. It now has several liquor stores, and it will soon have more. It has one dispensary and will soon have more than one. Can you speak to the decision to approve dispensaries from the town planning perspective?
Sure. So, as I'm sure many of the viewers know, in 2016 there was a ballot question to legalize adult use recreational or adult use recreational use, which Arlington voted yes on. So more than 50% of the community agreed with the ballot question and said we would like this in our community. From the perspective of the department that I work for, which is the Department of Planning and Community Development, and also, the entire town, is that we were implementing the will of the voters. So while I have my own personal opinions about the use, I, needed to be able to enact what the voters told us they wanted to see in the community. If Arlington voted no, we would have done that too. It was a vote of the community, and we needed to implement it. So that's what we did. Took us a little while because we were waiting for the Cannabis Control Commission to release the regulations so that we could base our zoning on something that was adopted and real, and that we didn't want to conflict with. So eventually in late 2018, Arlington held a special town meeting, at which point we proposed zoning amendments, which were adopted by town meeting and went into effect shortly thereafter.
Awesome. Okay, so we're going to return to all of our panelists. I want to ask Dianna now, and I have been waiting for many weeks actually to ask Dianna a whole series of questions, but I'm trying to just keep it to at least a couple out of the gate. Can you, having worked both in a large dispensary in Brookline and now in our local dispensary, can you describe for listeners who have not been to a dispensary or our dispensary, the experience in the shop day to day, and maybe in a way that provides some sense to parents about the kind of safeguards, but really also just the day-to-day, how does it work in a dispensary?
Oh, okay. Thanks, Steve. That is a huge question. What I want to emphasize, though, is the dispensary Apopka where I work is so brilliantly suited to Arlington. I really feel that. It is much smaller than the dispensary where I got the bulk of my training. However, I just marvel at the neighborliness of it. Now, understanding this neighborliness does come with very high fences. There are 3 levels of security. So 3 points where the ID is checked. And of course, we're not blind. We're very sensible. We're taking a look at our customers and certainly welcoming them in if they are 21 and above with a valid ID. All right. So it feels very secure and yet somehow very friendly. Every single day I have people coming in. I live down the street. I'm so glad you're here. I don't have to go to Brookline anymore. I'm so glad you're here. I've never been to a dispensary before. I'm so glad you're here. I mean, I'm from Arlington. I'm delighted. And that's what I tell people. We're delighted to see you. We're delighted to be here, open to everyone. We're not medical yet, but that's coming. That's really important. And it is unfortunately due to the CCC, but that is the way it is. But when we are, we will be open to both patients and recreational adult use customers, of which some of them are patients. They just choose not to go through the licensing. So I think I'll stop there and we'll go on as the night goes.
Okay, awesome, terrific. I'm going to encourage people again who are on this show, just listening, hearing our voices. I'm going to ask a couple more questions, and then I'm going to be eager to see some questions come in from the people. You guys know what you want to know. I can, ask questions until the cows come home. I certainly have a long list, but we're going to have the best conversation if people who are hearing the conversation, if you guys raise your questions. You've got 3 panelists who really, I think, know a lot about the dispensary and how it got here, and in general about cannabis use. So I'm hoping some questions will start coming in from you guys who are listening. In the meantime, I'm curious to ask Dianna, just again, a kind of basic question, which is, can you describe, this might sound sort of simplistic, but I have not been in, I don't think I've ever been in a dispensary. It sounds quite unlikely, but it's true. I've never been in a dispensary. Can you describe sort of the packaging? I've heard that some stores have like child-proof packaging, which seems maybe important, because I know that like pot is no longer just like back in the old days where you knew it was a joint or it was something that was smoked in a pipe. Now there are all these edibles in various forms. Kind of how does the packaging work? What does the product look like?
Terrific question again. There are a lot of regulations, and I've read them all repeatedly. So I noticed that at the previous dispensary, things were packaged strenuously, let's just say. The requirements, though, of the regulations mandate that each product be either tamper-proof or child-proof when it leaves the building. And all packaging is, sometimes both, very often both. So that's for, of course, the safety of our children, definitely, but also it's a protection, a legal protection for people who are transporting cannabis from the dispensary to their homes, where cannabis is a private consumption. It should be done in private. So it's both those levels, to protect our children from it, but also to protect the consumer until they get home, or the medicine and the patient until they get home. So this is mandated and carefully followed. I mean, I've noticed that dispensaries are built on regulation. I just can't, on compliance. It's really impressed me how concerned the dispensaries are with the regulations and doing them correctly, as well as, of course, knowing about the medicine and customer service.
I got you. Absolutely. I have a quick question that's actually for Cindy, but actually it's for anybody on the panel. I'm just curious about the prevalence of cannabis use, and in particular among teens. Is there any data? Are there any data that compare towns that do not have dispensaries with towns that do have dispensaries, or maybe even anecdotally, Cindy? What have you seen? Has there been any kind of difference between before the dispensary came and after the dispensary?
So I want to be clear that this is more of an anecdotal comment. I don't believe that it's the dispensary in a town that is having the impact and the spike we're seeing among marijuana use in younger and younger students. It's the access, which it doesn't come from the dispensary, but the access has been greater. And that access is becoming greater because there are fewer consequences around possession. And I also believe that the messaging that we're giving kids, that they're kind of processing, there's a very direct link between perception of harm, perception of what you believe your community and your guardians or parents believe is the harm, and the participation in that risky behavior. Mm-hmm. So I think the message that we've given kids is that this is really not harmful. And it's really hard anyway for kids to understand that there's a difference between a substance impact on a younger brain and a younger body versus an adult brain and an adult body. So I think it's that perception that we're seeing spikes in use.
Erin, do you want to speak to that as somebody who obviously was looking at the permitting process?
Yeah, sure. So when we, myself, other town officials, and a number of residents that formed the Marijuana Study Committee, when we were looking at developing the zoning regulations, we knew that the Cannabis Control Commission, or the CCC, had established a 500-foot buffer around K through 12 public and private schools. But there was some interest in the Marijuana Study Committee to look at other sensitive land uses, and determine whether or not we wanted to add a buffer around those parcels within the community as a way to sort of limit the exposure of younger children or young adults around dispensaries. Because even though Apotheca, for example, is frosted, I mean, everyone knows what's going on in that shop. But in a way to sort of have it less right next door to other uses that where young adults or children might be congregating. So in addition, in the zoning, in addition to K through 12 public and private schools, we adopted a buffer around the public libraries. In particular, there's the teen room in the Robbins Library. So that was really important to the Marijuana Study Group. And then additionally, we established a buffer around town-owned recreation facilities and playgrounds, which was also really important to the Marijuana Study Group. So that was those sort of conversations about not wanting to provide adequate space to support this use that we were told by the voters needed to come to Arlington. We also wanted to make sure that it was in locations where it wasn't going to be flashy or right next to a use where kids may be congregating. So that was one way that we tried to address that from the start as well, through the zoning regulations.
Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm curious, just as a quick follow-up, Erin, other states are actually launching delivery from dispensaries. Is Arlington, is that in the cards where you can home deliver?
So I've been following the Cannabis Control Commission's regulations and notices about it. They've actually extended their comment period on those draft regulations. So until something comes out official and adopted from the Cannabis Control Commission, we probably won't look to address it. But right now, as someone who works in the planning department and fields phone calls from interested parties to operate in Arlington, this is not something that we've been fielding phone calls on, but who knows, maybe in the future, if it's something that the town feels like they need to regulate in either through the Board of Health regulations or through the zoning. But that's really the two ways that we can regulate this use. Gotcha.
I want to dig into the question, which I think Cindy was raising, and Dianna too, to some extent, which has to do with sort of the cultural permission structure around cannabis use, which has really shifted. But before I do that, I want to just ask Erin a couple of quick factual questions that have come over the transom, which are really, I think, easy to answer. Where the new dispensary is going to be, and what is the limit to the total number allowed in Arlington?
Sure. So, of course, Apotheca is located in Arlington Heights, in the former Swifty building. Escar, which is the second dispensary, it's actually under consideration. Their special permit is under consideration by the redevelopment board currently. They are planning to open at 23 Broadway, which is the former Teamsters Credit Union, right near the Somerville line. And then the select board is considering 2 applicants for the third and final host community agreement for retail shops. And those two, those two applicants have proposed two different locations, one on Mass Ave near Route 16 and the other one on Summer Street. So we'll see which one is the third, but that leads to your second question, that the zoning capped the number of retail shops in Arlington at 3. So that would be the end of it. And I'll also point out, these are sort of, with the exception of the one on Broadway and the applicant that's interested in opening one on Mass Ave, the zoning was designed to sort of separate, to de-densify the use across the community.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and will they all be for recreational use at the moment, or Dianna had mentioned the possibility of medical use? Has that hasn't been determined yet? Initially, anyway, there'll be recreational use.
So I understand that Apotheca will offer medical sales in the future. That's what they used to do at their former location on Water Street. They used to be a medical dispensary. Escar is fully recreational, and I'm not certain of the plans of the two applicants that are under consideration for a host community agreement, but I would suspect that they will be fully recreational as well.
Okay, awesome. So now I want to return to sort of the kind of a little bit thornier, less factual and more sort of cultural attitudinal part of this, which is, what Cindy was talking about around the permission structure. The way that I see it, and I think, Dianna, you would probably agree, is that the dispensaries, in a sense, are an outgrowth of a big shift in the way that the culture regards cannabis. And of course, we've seen this with the history of alcohol, cigarettes. There have been incredible shifts in how they are perceived as both commodities and also, I guess, to put it in an old-timey way, as vices. And I think there's been a big shift in the way that cannabis is regarded, for instance, as a medicinal application as well as a recreational, right? I think that's pretty clear from not just sort of medical data, but just from our own cultural experience. What I'm curious about is to ask Dianna a little bit about how she sees that evolution as having gone, and then throw it to Cindy. And if you can, Cindy, talk a little bit about how parents should be, you mentioned modeling, but kind of how do parents cope with the fact that the permission structure around pot has really changed? When I was growing up, it was just illegal and you snuck around and got it however you could. And now it occupies a much more ambiguous, sort of morally ambiguous spot. I don't mean that as any denigration. It's not a for or against statement. It's just much squishier these days. So Dianna, can you talk a little bit about that, the shifting perceptions, and then maybe Cindy, you can speak about it in terms of how do you translate that to a teenager?
Wow. Okay. I'm really new to cannabis, which is a strange, but I guess that's indicative of my perception of it. So I think probably the last time we had to vote as a state, I would have voted no.
Interesting.
But
why?
Yeah, exactly. Peer pressure, I'd say. But my journey with the cannabis, as I understand it now, started really just 2.5 years ago, when my mother got off the plane for a family reunion carrying her medical cannabis. And I'm like, I need to know more about this.
So your mom,
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes,
oh, good to
exactly.
know.
Right. So she is over 80 and she is allergic to acetaminophen. So we got some choices here, and that is what she chose to do. And it's been very successful. And I needed to know. And in a matter of a week, I had decided that I was going to study cannabis medicine. And then this is, I don't know, I used to work for Sephora and hawk retinol. Now I cannabis medicine. So it's just something that I believe in and I've studied, and I work with doctors, and that's why I'm there. So why it's sort of the cultural shift, I guess just because people driven to use it as medicine just brought it to our attention. And then I know this has been going on for decades, this use of it as medicine, and centuries, but even in our own country. But this resurgence, I think, was brought through patients, and that's certainly how it started in Massachusetts. It was an initiative on the part of patients. And then I am simply delighted that it is so, I don't know, delighted's not quite the word. It's essential to me that cannabis be tested rigorously. You know, I didn't use black market cannabis. I will not use black market cannabis. I don't want anybody I care about using black market cannabis. I want it tested. I want to know what's in it. So that's also important, and that came up with the cultural shift, the sort of the structure around it. Yeah.
I want to ask you something more about that, which has to do with the potency of pot and the TCH levels. But before I do that, I want to really get Cindy to give us some guidance or some feedback on kind of how you see this shifting cultural role as complicating the sort of talks that parents like me, and I hope people who are tuned in are having with their kids. We can't say this is against the law, you'll be arrested. And in fact, we could even say, it's a much more complicated answer. How do you contend with that? What's your advice around how to then have dialogue with young, teenagers or young adults?
I actually don't think it's that complicated, because I think we already went into this when there was such dialogue around medical marijuana. We were already having conversations with our kids about alcohol use, early alcohol use. So we were already really understanding, that these kids have underdeveloped frontal lobes, and that substances can do damage to that when their frontal lobes are still developing. And I think in the last few years, a lot of research has been done about the impact of marijuana on young developing brains. So I really do think that it's very similar to the way we would talk to our kids about alcohol use. And parents now have a lot to talk to their kids about. I mean, screen use, I think, might be even more complicated than talking about marijuana use for some parents. But the important piece is that you are, as parents, that we are communicating with our kids what our beliefs are, what our standards are, and engaging them in the conversation around why do we as a family have this kind of standard? What is important to us as a family, and how do these things relate to that as a family? And that doesn't have to be the same from one household to another. The important part is that we're having these conversations, and we're having them with our kids when they're young. To start this conversation when our kids are in high school is not going to be hugely effective. That we want our kids from a young age to really understand what really the spirit of their family is, what their family is all about, and who they're representing when they walk out the door, even during those muddled teenage years. That can really help kids get through the tough time of making difficult decisions and trying to kind of navigate riskier situations. So I do think the conversation is very similar to the ones that we would have with our kids about alcohol use or screen use. And again, engaging in conversation with our kids, not lecturing. Right.
Good. I think that's an important thing to note, is that, I guess, sort of the more you can listen, the more you'll get, as opposed to the lectures. And I mean, honestly, another factor that I was thinking about as you were talking, Cindy, is it's also that now, there are far more medications, frankly, including medication that are around anxiety or mood, that kids are prescribed at younger and younger ages, or even attention deficit disorder, various things. There is a sense that cannabis, as opposed to pot in the old days, but cannabis is, at least for adult users for whom it is appropriate, that it serves in a certain way. There's at least some overlap in the way that an adult user of cannabis might talk about its ability to relieve anxiety, for instance. That is an overlap with, if you have a kid who has takes a medicine that is around their anxiety. So even that, I think, has made things more complicated. I'm curious. We have a few questions in the comments, and please send more. I really want you guys to be driving this in terms of the questions, but I'm curious, just because of something that I've observed as so powerfully different than when I was growing up back in the 1840s. Back then, pot was not, certainly Dianna will know, it was only black market. That's what existed. But the other thing about it that was very clear is it just wasn't as potent and powerful. And what has shocked me as somebody who sort of at least has a toe in the brave new world of cannabis is that they have just found delivery systems where it's just much more potent. There were people will have remember the old days where you could, I don't know, smoke half a joint, say. I can't even imagine what would happen to me if I had more than 2 puffs, because of the way that pot is engineered now, frankly. And if any of you can speak to that, I would like to hear what you have to say, because it's something I think about. If I think about a kid at a party, one of my kids, for instance, having 1 puff, it feels different. And I might be wrong about this, but it feels different to have 1 puff of from a vape in terms of how much TCH is going to hit that kid's system than back when it was black market and the potency of pot was just much lower.
Well, I'm happy to answer that question. It is a lot stronger. Not all of it. It is a plant, and we're limited to plant things in terms of making it grow. But of course, you can process it. The whole vape thing, those are very, very strong. Mm-hmm. The good ones are like 90% pure THC. And then there's even the weaker ones are 70% THC. So a joint, a pre-roll, as we call it, is much more similar to the old days. But there are processed products, distillate and cartridges that are a lot stronger. I think that part of our defense is that we know it's tested, it's listed, what's in it. Also, the cartridges, there was a big kerfuffle last Christmas, and that was, again, stuff that was not tested, was not regulated, and there was some additives in it that were causing more problems than the actual THC. So that was a real problem for underage users in particular. Mm-hmm. And over users as well. It is definitely strong. The state attempts to put a limit on the serving size, as it would with edibles. It's limited to 5, and all our edibles, all dispensary edibles in Massachusetts, it has to be indicated that it's 5. And then the biggest package you could buy is 100, but it's still, that's not a control at all. It's really just a guide. And there's no way that you could limit puffs on a vaporizer cartridge or on a pre-roll. So it is much stronger. It is much stronger, and so I guess that is the price of capitalism. It is certainly the goal of many people to get the highest. That does happen. Give me your strongest stuff. I hear that. Interestingly enough, many times from people who smoked in the 70s. So I hear we have a lot of people doing that. They give me your strongest stuff. So there's that. And then also, I lost my train of thought here about the testing. That when I counsel people on how to use it therapeutically, let's say, it's all about a very, very small dose, a single sip. And that's where a cartridge can come in very handy. It's very hard to take a sip off of a pre-roll, but it's a lot easier to take a sip off of a cartridge. So somehow the packaging can either be helpful or a little bit risky, but it is the modern market.
I got you. And I do know just from anecdotal experience that sometimes edibles, that way you really can microdose. I have another question for Dianna, but I want to ask Cindy about that. Just the sheer potency of pot these days, just the level of TCH that's in them.
So we've seen some pretty significant changes in the last few years. We see kids who are impaired during the school day, who are so impaired it was hard for one of our deans to adjust, because every time, when we would have a child in the nurse's office and they were impaired, it didn't feel right. It felt like we've got to send them to the hospital, because this can't possibly be from marijuana. This child is that impaired. So the potency has definitely impacted kind of everybody's reaction to the impairment during the school day. And so that we've struggled with that. And it's hard sometimes to understand if a child's safe or not when they're that severely impaired. The other thing we've seen, especially with vapes, is that kids are using both. If they're vaping marijuana, they're very likely vaping tobacco as well, and or nicotine rather. And so they're vaping a highly addictive stimulant on one end of the hour, and then they're vaping a very potent THC oil. And so we're seeing all of a sudden some pretty different behavior in terms of what we might have seen 10 years ago. We're seeing kids who have much higher drug-seeking behaviors during the school day, more aggressive. I think everybody here can remember, 20, 30 years ago when somebody was impaired, maybe in the cafeteria, they were really chilled out. And we're really not seeing that the way we used to. Again, much, much more aggression than you would ever imagine, because somebody is smoking. And again, I think that's the combination of the addictive nicotine product and then also being impaired from potent THC.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. And I'm reminded by Dianna that it is THC, not TCH, as I was wishing to call it. That is the failed pot nerd in me. I want to ask another pot nerd question, but this one actually comes from Andrea. She wants to know, where is the product grown and processed? Is it a few large growers, many small growers? She's curious about the supply chain.
Okay. Yeah, Massachusetts is brilliant. Let's keep it in Massachusetts. All products in a dispensary have to be from Massachusetts. So you can either be a grower, a manufacturer, or all three. So my previous dispensary, we did all three. They had a big growth facility in Franklin, Massachusetts, which is a town that is very, very welcoming to cannabis. They wanted a big grow facility there, and our administrative offices were there in Franklin. They viewed it as a job provider, which it is. And then at my current place, there is a smaller grow, which is in Fitchburg, also a cannabis-friendly community. And we wholesale products from other dispensaries. Again, everything is made in Massachusetts and is tested by Massachusetts labs. Frankly, we could use another lab. There's only 2 labs and things get bottlenecked, but everything has to be tested. Everything. The flower, right up until the finished product, they have to be tested. And it has to be kept in Massachusetts, which I think is delightful and certainly economically sound.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. So like the days of it's Humboldt, it's Maui Wowie, that's over. That's all over. Artisanal, locally sourced.
There you go.
Okay.
Yes, it is. Yes. The regulated stuff is.
Right.
Yes.
Right. That's right. The regulated stuff.
Yes. That's a problem in the West.
Right. Okay.
Cross-border.
We're the hidebound Yankee tradition. So we're going to have our little pilgrim plantation of pot that's going to be right here in Massachusetts. Right. Good.
Yes. I don't think it's in Plymouth though, but yeah.
So another question that comes from the community, it's an anonymous question, but it's not that ominous. Somebody's wondering, how do the financials work at the dispensary? Can the money be deposited in a bank account? Can customers use a credit card? And I think there's a sort of subtext to this question, which might be sort of what shows up on the receipt.
Oh, these are brilliant questions. Absolutely. So cannabis is federally illegal. Okay, it is. So at the dispensary, cash is certainly welcome. Not coins, interestingly. I don't deal in coins. We just get rid of any change that happens in a transaction. But cash is welcome, as is debit. Dispensaries, well, let's just put it this way. Drug dealers are not given merchant accounts. So we do not have credit cards. We do not have debit cards. What we have is a third-party ATM, a little tiny point of sale ATM that charges $3.50 per transaction. And this is not money that comes to the dispensary. It is money that goes to the supplier of the ATM. And that is what enables us to take cards. Now, the sums are such that some people don't want to carry that amount of cash around, and so they use cards, although it can be for little as $15. So that's why that is. And what shows up on the bank statement is usually just an address. It doesn't say the dispensary name. It doesn't say Cannabis. It will just say 1386 Mass Ave, ATM, just like the Bank of America ATM, which is right there, 1386 Mass Ave.
Well, this is a related question actually from Ben, who's curious about sort of data usage. That is, what data related to dispensary customers is shared with public, private, and government entities, and what, why, and how. So that's a number of questions, but maybe Dianna, you can at least give us a start.
Yeah, it's, again, highly regulated, okay? So if a person needs to or chooses to become a medical patient in Massachusetts, a medical cannabis patient, I'm not going to lie, everything is state knowledge, right? They use my driver's license. I am a patient, a medical patient. They use my driver's license, and every single thing I purchase at a dispensary is tracked. So there is no hiding. There's no hiding that at all, nor do I wish to. So that's fine. Now, a recreational or adult use customer has some choices. First of all, they need a valid ID, and it is scanned. It is scanned at the door for validity only. Validity, whether it is a real ID and whether it is in date. Okay? So, however, that information is recorded only for the day. And the idea behind that is a second visit to a dispensary is permitted, but no more. So that is a way to control consumption. So it is recorded for that day, and then it is forgotten.
Right.
All right. Then once you're at the point of sale, there is no record at all. There's no record at all. Now, if people choose to order online, that's a third party, and I'm not entirely sure what they do with those emails and phone numbers and so on. That is a third party. We have an order online service, but the person still needs to come into the dispensary, make the purchase in person, and that information is not stored or even recorded.
Absolutely. So that idea of 2 visits a day kind of puts me in mind of something I want to ask Cindy about, which is the possibility, which of course, dispensaries, I think, obviously have very high fences, but they also have doors, right? So the possibility that, I guess I'm curious, without, meaning any acrimony or, but I'm curious, just from your sort of frontline view of things, where you're working with students and trying to provide diversion and intervention with students who might be, using and in ways that are destructive to primarily their own education, but it sounds like also, the larger educational system. What was your attitude when, when Arlington voted to approve, dispensaries, and when the process was moving through and dispensaries came to town? Just from your particular angle, what did you intuitively think?
I think the first thing I thought of was, again, the messaging and what is it that we're telling our kids, and what's the perception going to be moving forward, and what is kind of the risk of harm that's going to be associated with this or not associated with this. And I think that it was more about the messaging and thinking about the ways that, a student with an underdeveloped frontal lobe behaves anyway and processes things, that it was gonna increase use among students, which it did. So I knew that was going to happen. I'm very grateful to live in a town that really took the process very seriously and did a lot of research and did a lot of really thoughtful work around even just the placement of dispensaries. So I think initially my reaction was not good. I mean, it was because my job and my purpose is to really guide and support children to access their best emotional health and physical health and academic health. And marijuana is not a real support in those areas for children.
So what has been sort of your expectation was, or, as you're watching this, I'm sure you were, closely sort of monitoring where it was in the process of being a ballot question and then seeking approvals and the dispensary showing up and now others on the way. Has the rise in use been commensurate with your expectations, greater, smaller?
Oh, I would say it would fall in line to what I expected to see. What I didn't expect to see was the emergence of vapes and how severely that would impact behaviors and, again, access to education and to emotional health. That was a surprise to me because we did a lot of work, especially in this town and across the country, in turning around the perception of tobacco use. And we saw the numbers in this country just completely dive, which was wonderful to see. And that was really about kids getting the message from their community, from the folks at home, from the schools, that this is really harmful. And as a result, we saw this major shift away from tobacco use. And with the emergence of vapes, and then the combination of highly addictive nicotine in those vapes, in combination then with a very easily accessible way to ingest marijuana, I think that that was the piece I didn't see coming.
How does that work? What's the relationship there? And obviously both Erin and Dianna can weigh in on this as well if you have some expertise or even informed perspective. I don't quite see the relationship because I'm an idiot, but what do you think is the relationship between that dispensaries and increased access to cannabis and this rise in vape use?
So I guess I don't believe that the dispensaries had an impact specifically on the vape use. I think that the combination, it was just bad timing. That our kids are getting this message from us, that this is not a harmful thing, it's not a harmful substance, and again, having trouble discerning between activity prior to being in your early to mid-20s versus activity, once you're an adult. And so I just think that there was this collision of that messaging to kids and then having nothing to do with dispensaries, having the vapes hit, and it hit hard and it hit fast. And, it's the same device that they can just interchange the pods. One's a THC pod and the other one's a nicotine pod. So I think it was just an unfortunate collision, but I think the dispensaries, I think it was more about the passage of the law than I think seeing the dispensaries come into town. I think by the time dispensaries came here, people were, I think the message was out, and I think that the kids get it. I mean, I think they've taken the message that I think we are not surprised they took from it.
Interesting. So, all right. So it's basically you can change the cartridge. This is all new to me, although it speaks to my naivete, but it's literally as simple as you use the same device, just different cartridge. Yeah. So I want to ask Dianna a specific question that's come in, and then I want to get back more to getting the conversation that we might be having with young adults and teenagers. The question I have for Dianna it has to do with the restrictions, or if there are any restrictions about carrying edibles, right? What if I walked into my kid's school with edibles in my pocket, for instance? Are there restrictions in place, or is that, again, just the user has to has to regulate their own behavior.
Yeah, it's about the user. It is. So I always counsel people that the best place to transport cannabis is actually in the trunk of a car, as far away from a driver as possible, and also that kind of locked. Okay, and then once home, the recommendation in the regulations is that cannabis at home be kept in a locked container. That is in the regulation. Okay, but we are dealing with reality. And so the packaging is so that it is evident when it has been opened. All right. And you are not meant to have an open container. So I don't carry stuff around with me, and I can't recommend it. It should be kept in a locked container or the trunk of the car if it needs to be moved between one place or another. Now, whether there are any legal repercussions, I imagine there could be if a police officer needed to do that. If the tamper sticker is broken or the childproof seal is broken, that's not ideal. Mm-hmm. But the dispensary can do only so much, as in to give it to the consumer in the appropriate packaging to transport home.
Okay. I have a question from an anonymous email, actually, but it's nothing nefarious. And I think Erin's probably in a good position, maybe Dianna as well, to answer this. What is the tax charged by Arlington on cannabis? Does the percentage vary from town to town, or is it a set levy?
So in Arlington, it's 3% of the gross sales of the dispensary, and that is returned to the town for our use, which is spelled out in the host community agreement. And I believe that that upper limit is set by state law. There, in the earlier days of permitting other, dispensaries in other communities in the Commonwealth, there were some differences in what towns were charging dispensaries to open. There was also additional asks built into the host community agreement, anywhere from, it's something as crazy as contribute to a fire truck, to something that's clearly relevant to the use, which would be, contribute to diversion programs. But the Cannabis Control Commission sort of brought that all back under control within the past year or so. So it is pretty much a standard across the board in the Commonwealth. And if I misspoke, Dianna can certainly jump in on that. And that's paid annually back to the community.
This is a related question from Greg. He's asking, from a business standpoint, have the dispensaries been successful, profitable endeavors for the people opening them, and do regulations create a big burden on them?
If I might just note an anecdote that I heard from the town's economic development coordinator just today. Sure. So Apotheca, it's a really tough time for businesses anywhere with the pandemic. So the town of Arlington has been trying to step up on a number of levels, and including in that is establishing parklets. The economic development coordinator was in Arlington Heights today and speaking to some of the businesses that are sort of fast casual places nearby Apotheca. And those other businesses were so happy about the contribution to that small business community, that they've been really thrilled with Apotheca's presence in the community. And from my point of view, from someone who might get a phone call from a neighbor, I have not fielded much at all. Maybe my colleagues in the Board of Health have heard relative to health and safety relevant to the pandemic, but from all accounts, Apotheca is being a good neighbor in the Arlington Heights business community, and seemingly successful. Certainly Dianna probably has, knows more from working in that location.
I'm going to just imagine that any of the food shops close to Apotheca might have seen an uptick in business, but that's probably. Dianna, what can you tell Greg about the success, just economic success of the dispensary?
Yes. Okay. Couple of things. So first of all, the tax rate is 20% overall. So I wanted to say that it is a bit of a rude shock when someone comes in to buy something for $50 and they leave having paid $60. It is a considerable amount of money. I did not know exactly what Arlington got from that. I wish it were more, but the town does benefit. And I do know, for a variety of reasons, what my previous employer, it was to the tune of 17 million in a year. That's what went to the town. So it's a lot of money. The neighborhood around us is definitely happy. We keep getting delivery of free food because they are so happy. And it is a bit of a fallacy that THC causes the munchies. That is not entirely true, but we can talk about that later. What I found very interesting, though, is speaking with the owner of Apotheca. Cannabis is perceived as a cash cow, but it is not, because it is federally illegal. Many of the tax write-offs and the sort of depreciation and all that business stuff I'm not super familiar with, it's not permitted. So every charge, every cost that might be written off by another business of any sort is not. So yes, there is a fair amount of money that comes through. That is true. It's an expensive, regulated product, and a good part of that goes to the state and to the host community. And I think that's exactly as it should be. But it's not like he's rolling in it. No, that's Zuckerberg, not Apotheca.
Okay, gotcha.
Or Jeff Bezos.
Great question from actually Mary's husband, Jamie, asks, we know that marijuana is harmful to the developing brains of teens. Is there data, I assume that's supposed to be data, on whether or not there are actually greater numbers of teens using? And anybody who wants to jump in, though, certainly Cindy, I would imagine this is kind of in your bailiwick.
Yes, I mean, every year it's increased.
What kind of increases? If you remember?
Well, in 2 years' time, it went up. It went up from 17% to almost 21% and that's just the high school students. We're seeing younger students using as well. And I think a lot of this, again, goes back to those conversations that are happening at home, that they aren't happening, and the kids aren't, so they're getting information wherever they can get information. So they're picking it up from around them, and this is legal now, so it must be fine. So I think the increased use is, I do believe that the perception of harm has been lowered, and so we see a very natural increased use from that. It's important for parents to really consider how any substance, but especially marijuana, can impact their child's quality of life as a student and as a friend and as a teammate, and understand that there are still some of those old misperceptions still around, even today, with such a higher potency of substance. So, for example, driving while impaired. I mean, how many years and years would we hear from people that, I focus much better behind the wheel when I'm high, right? I mean, that's always kind of been a pretty poor message. And we're seeing an increase in car crashes because of marijuana impairment. So I think that parents have got to be really clear about what the perception of harm is to their child with the use of marijuana. And again, to start that conversation a lot earlier. I think that if we really are honest and consider the messages, that the conversations will be a lot more successful, and we'll see a decline in use. But right now, it's just every year it's going up.
Let me press on that a little bit more, Cindy, because I'm curious about having a couple of teenagers in my house. It seems to me that part of the job of the teenager is to push against
Mhm.
the prevailing authority, right? And so what I'm trying to figure out, like a friend of mine told me this story a few weeks ago, and he basically said, well, I knew my son was going to go to a party. I knew that there was going to be pot use there. And so I said, look, I know that this is what's going to happen. We got Corona. I am going to give you, a one hitter for your use only, with a designated amount, versus unchecked use and so forth. I'm not asking you to sort of judge that parent's conduct, but it is on the spectrum of, well, how much do we concede? How much is it better to be upfront and recognize moderate use as a better alternative to sort of making it entirely prohibited, or trying to put down a hard line with the recognition that at least many teenagers are going to find pot more alluring because it's been strictly, absolutely prohibited. And I'm just thinking about the relationship that kids see in terms of alcohol use, right? We don't hide if there's wine at dinner. There are dinner parties where, or drinking beer, on the back porch if the weather's. Do you see what I mean? It seems to be that the paradigm of use and adult use hasn't really caught up to the prevalence of use.
Those are a lot of loaded questions in there.
Sorry.
I think there are a couple of things. When teenagers aren't really into moderation about anything, and so that's something that I think we forget when we are one-on-one with a teenager who is just really bright and grounded and is active in the community. And we forget that regardless of all of that, there's a teenager in front of us who has a brain that still has a way to go. And the part of the brain that has a way to go is the part of the brain where they kind of process the actions and consequences to those actions. So of course, it's never surprising when a teenager does something that wasn't really well thought through. So I think it's important to remember that no, our teenagers are not really into moderation. Something else to think about is that one of the risks about a young person engaging in substance use of any kind, but especially marijuana, is that they're more likely to engage in another risky behavior while they're impaired. Whereas an adult user may be better at being able to engage that frontal lobe, even impaired, and not perhaps dive into risky behavior. So that's something else that I think parents really have to consider when they're having these conversations about marijuana use. And I guess lastly, I'd like to add that it is the job of teenagers to push limits. It's their job. That's how they grow. That's how they develop. That's how they turn into these wonderful human beings, who leave and go try to kind of figure out what they want to do with their life at some point. And I've always believed in a very wise former principal kind of put this thought in my head many years ago. If they're going to push, if that's their job to push against boundaries, and they don't have any boundaries to push against, they're going to run through a minefield of risks to find something to push against. Mm-hmm. So if that's their job, right, we've got to kind of structure some boundaries so they have something to push up against.
So let me ask you then, how do you put up that boundary when it has to do with cannabis use, pot use? In other words, how do you put it up without it feeling like a wall that they have to scale out of their own curiosity or pride or just rebellious nature?
So first of all, they may scale it and they may push against it and then through it. But what we see is that kids who have that structure, even if they push through that structure, there is something that gives them a better sense of confidence about who they are and where they're coming from, and about then working through any potential consequences to some of their behavior. So I get the question from parents all the time. I don't want to restrict them so severely that they're going to just want to run out and do that, whatever that is. But again, that's the boundary we're talking about. They need to push on something. And if we give them nothing to push on, the least of our worries is going to be that they might, smoke marijuana a couple times a month. They've got to have something to push up against, just to help them get to a point where their brain is a little bit closer to fully developed. The other thing is very important is to, if you're a parent who's being clear about this and you have really specific expectations and really hopes for your children. I mean, you hope that your children can kind of get through this piece of life in a healthy way where they're not damaging a growing brain. And remember that that's what it's all about, to remind your kids that any boundaries you have is really about their growth and development and about your hope for them to have a successful, happy life. And if they make a mistake, which they will, there's a lot of growth and mistakes, the best thing that they can know is that regardless of the consequences, the safest place they can be as a child is in their home with their parents or their guardians. And that no matter what they do, you might be in trouble, but you're still safer here. You're still safer to call me if you're so impaired that you can't get behind that wheel of the car than getting behind that wheel of the car.
Right. Or perhaps even to feel comfortable if they do make a bad decision around cannabis or anything else, to not be ashamed to get in touch. That seems to me like, again, I'm not there yet. I hope I'm not there for a while, but there might come that time. And I think that I've always thought probably the message I want to send is, we'll work out the discipline part later, but just to make sure that they get in touch if they feel overwhelmed.
Absolutely.
In whatever way. Good. All right. Well, I want to, if people have additional questions about that, how to have those conversations, want to ask more about that, again, please put something in the comment section and we'll make sure those questions get asked. I have a quick question that's not silly exactly. I'm genuinely curious, Dianna. What do people come into Apotheca seeking, if you know what I mean? What are the range of things that they will that you encounter in a customer? What are they looking for? I mean, I know they're looking for cannabis, but why? Like, in other words, are they coming in because they're, having sleepless nights or anxiety or pleasure, recreation, loosen up? What's your impression of, again, just sort of giving us maybe an anecdote or two about why you think people are using cannabis, coming to Apotheca to get it? Oops. So I think Diana's muted.
I got it.
There you
I'm
go.
trying to quantify, the people that we see. There are a lot of people that come in seeking help with sleep, definitely. And there are certain ways to use certain kinds of cannabis to facilitate that, either falling asleep or staying asleep, or also anxiety and pain. Those are huge. The one that intrigues me personally is people who want to drink less. I'm seeing a lot of that. Again, we're talking about adults here. According to my research, cannabis use, moderate cannabis use, is less consequential for our bodies and minds and spirits than alcohol use. There is different outcomes. There's different behaviors. It can be used. They both are be used as rituals or to mark occasions, or again to fight sleeplessness, anxiety, and depression. I think it's just more successful because it is also a medicine, and people can be taught to use it as medicine, even in a recreational setting. Okay, and then there are people who come in for a single pre-roll. That happens too. You've got people just passing through. Sometimes it's daily. They just come in for a single pre-roll. That's it, and go. It really feels very much right now that people are buying for their own consumption. We're not talking extraordinary amounts. First of all, there is a limit on what they can buy. It is.
What is
it
that?
is yes, it is 1 ounce. So 1 ounce. It's easy to understand that in terms of 28 grams and 1/8 of flour. Oh, let's talk about a pre-roll. A pre-roll is 1 gram. Okay, so you'd have to buy a whole lot of pre-rolls to come up to that state limit, but and people just don't. They just don't. The quantities are still, while there's a fair bit of money, the quantities are not excessive. Rarely questionable. Not that I can question it. It's not my business, but I can limit it. I can limit it to 1 ounce. Now, patients, it's very different. Their limit is 10 ounces. Now, Erin, in Arlington, it's limited to 5 ounces. So over 30 days. So there is a special limit in Arlington for medical patients, but 5 ounces is an enormous amount of medicine. So that's not really an issue.
Okay, absolutely. And there's a wonderful comment from Mary, or maybe from Jamie, saying that part of what we're getting at, I think, Cindy, you would agree, is that in talking about cannabis use with teenagers or pot use, the idea is to help them really reflect about risk and judgment, rather than, and I very much heard what you said. Believe me, I heard what you said about setting a boundary and the necessity of setting a boundary. But there's also something in trusting them enough to say, here is, you need to think about the risks associated, and you need to think about making good decisions, because we're living in a world where I think we could probably agree at some point or another they're going to encounter the opportunity, right? So then it's a matter of them being able to use good judgment around it.
And the best way to have the conversation about risk is to start with the questions to them. What do you think the risk might be? And kids have a lot to share, and it's really great as a parent to kind of find out where they are with some of these things. And it's most important for them to be able to think about it in terms, that's critical thinking, right? It's kind of really thinking about their own experiences and their observations. And that is going to have a pretty deep impact on your conversation with your child. Is opening with the question, what do you think the risk may be?
Absolutely. I want to put out a call again to folks. If you do have questions, we're most interested in hearing what you guys want to hear our panelist address. I'm curious, again, this is just like very basic stuff, but it's something I wonder about. I'm assuming the answer to this is clearly no, but what is the age limit on who can go into a dispensary or apotheka in particular?
Yes, it is 21. It
21.
Is absolutely 21. Now, that changes when it's medical. So, but let's talk about the recreational, which is what we're dealing with in Arlington right now. Apotheka, it's 21, and that's a valid ID. And again, the different checks that we go through. This means no babes in arm, which surprised me. You can't even bring a baby that's obviously unaware of where you are into the dispensary. So no babies, certainly no children. At my previous employer, there were people who would approach the dispensary and ask me, not me, but us, to mind their children while they went in. Doesn't happen. That is not permitted. So there is an exception. Furry babies are permitted. I saw 2 gorgeous ones today. So yeah, furry babies are permitted, whether they're on a lead or furry babies in arms. Now, medical, it's a little trickier because a patient who is 18 years old, so a medical cannabis certified patient can come into a dispensary unattended. All right. A patient under 18 years old must come in with a caregiver, and their criteria for getting a medical card, we're talking about life-threatening conditions. So it is extremely well regulated.
I have a hypothetical. Actually, I'll a couple of questions have come in on the chat, but then I might have a hypothetical that I want to ask Erin. NB Coles asks, can I bring pot from Massachusetts into Vermont where it's also legal? What about from Massachusetts into Maine via New Hampshire? NB's got a plan. So how's it going to work out for him?
So I don't actually know the answer to that question, but
I do.
Only Diana does. I'm not going to even hazard a guess because I'd probably be wrong.
What do you think, Diana?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It is absolutely illegal to carry Massachusetts cannabis across state lines. It is absolutely illegal to bring in cannabis from out of state into Massachusetts to cross state lines. Absolutely illegal. And that is a message that we give regularly and unequivocally. And it still happens all the time.
Okay. All right. So, NB, that's a boundary. You have been warned. I want to return to a question that I was talking a little bit with Cindy about her just seeing use go up and significantly amongst teenagers and young adults. Erin, I'm wondering from the perspective of somebody who's involved in town planning, actually a couple things. Have you heard complaints at any point in the process, again, about a concern that one of the ancillary effects, obviously not the intended effect, but one of the ancillary effects might be increased use among younger people? And on the other side of it, if there was, if Cindy comes to you or the equivalent and says that we can continue to see increased use in our town, does that shift the math at all for the town in thinking about how many dispensaries or whether to have them at all?
Sure. So I would think that it wouldn't necessarily change the path that we've already gone on, particularly since we've permitted one, we're permitting a second, and the third is under consideration. There's the regulations in the town zoning does not allow us to go any further. However, I think with what we're allowed to do with our host community agreement, I think we would rely on the business establishments to work more closely with us, with the school department, with the Board of Health, with other experts in town to work on diversion programs. Certainly, that is something that is included in Arlington's host community agreements, and I think that gets more to the heart of what you're asking rather than something that I could do regulatory, which if like there was mass congestion on Mass Ave in front of Apotheca, that's where I would get involved with the police department. But I think we would, other officials in town through the Board of Health, the town manager's department, and the school department would work more closely with those businesses on their diversion programs and see where they can actually contribute to getting that information out.
So I have two follow-ups for you that are very practical questions. And I'll just let people know we'll probably wind up in 10, 15 minutes. So if you have a question, please get it in now. But here are my questions for you, Erin. One, why is Arlington only getting 3% of that 20% that Diana mentioned? I'm sure a lot of Arlingtonians are curious about that. And related to that, is there a need for 3 dispensaries? I'm sure and Diane might be able to speak to that too. But, Arlington.
No.
Is there a need for 3, or how is that number settled on? But let's take those one at a time. Why are we only getting 3% of a product that's being taxed at 20%?
So it was a local option that Arlington Town Meeting adopted when we adopted the regulations. So the upper limit is 3%. So that's where we are. We're at the highest amount that towns can levy over the gross sales, annual sales of that business per business. So we get 3% from Apotheca, we'll get 3% from Escar, and 3% from the third. So to your second question, the number of number of retail dispensaries that a community could allow is actually based on the number of package stores that are in the community, which I mean,
Huh.
I guess I can see the connection, but it's also a kind of a funny connection. So Arlington has 6 package stores. So we went, the least amount of stores that a community could allow is based on the number of package stores. So Arlington has 6 package stores. 20% of that would be the least number that we would be able to offer. Through the approval process with the redevelopment board and through town meeting, it landed at 3, based on those affirmative votes.
I got you. And then let me throw it to Cindy. And believe me, I'm not trying to stir up trouble, but I'm genuinely curious. How do you feel about that, Cindy? You've seen, again, not hanging this on the dispensary. There are lots of factors, but do you anticipate that if there are, I live in East Arlington, so presumably probably one of these dispensaries. I've never been by Apothecary. I'm sorry, Diana. I'll come. I'll come tomorrow. But it's really out of view for me, way on the east side of town, what we call the Lower East Side, Lower of Arlington. But if there are 3 dispensaries, presumably they'd sort of be, scattered around town. When you think about that, Cindy, do you sit there going, we're going to see even more prevalent use in youth, or what are you thinking?
I do think we'll probably see more prevalent use. Again, access and environment has a really deep impact on kids. And when they see access, and probably just like the liquor stores, they're going to be kind of hanging around trying to talk somebody who's 21 or older in and getting them something. And so I think that, yes, I think we'll see an increase in use because of that, because those are 2 kind of proven factors in terms of influences over kids' decisions.
Do you ever speak with, I don't know how candid a kid would be, but how are they getting pot? Is it the old, like, being outside a package store and, finding somebody who looks as scruffy as me and saying, hey, can you do me a favor, mister?
Well, I know they're making runs out of town for a while to some dispensaries. There's still a lot of them are just, getting it in a way that's not coming through a dispensary. I have not seen any cases where a student was able to convince somebody to go into a dispensary and buy it. A lot of the access is coming from home. And so right now the access is still kind of that informal, backdoor, illegal product. So, but I do know that when some of the dispensaries that opened before any of Arlington's, we definitely had kids running out there. And again, they kind of just hang around the corner and try to grab somebody who looks like they might, go in and get it for them, and they'll pay, more than what the person is going in and buying it for. So I would imagine that, we're going to have to talk about compliance checks and things like that to make sure that we don't have that sort of thing happening in Arlington.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Erin, is that something that you've considered? If there are 3 dispensaries and there's an uptick in use, is that something the town has thought about or had any discussions around?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, it took Apotheca close to a year or 2 from their permitting to open, through the state permitting process and through the local permitting process. SCAR is just beginning that, but they also have, quite a bit of public hearings in front of them, and then the fit out of the space that they want to open in, and getting their final license from the state. And then of course the third one is much further behind. So I think overall it's been sort of this gradual increase. So at this point, I don't think that conversation has been discussed. Potentially when the third shop, if it opens and we do see that might be where that conversation comes in, or even as SCAR is opening, how can we, from the town's point of view, contribute to diversion or prevention? I will note that at least at Apotheca, we did require through my permitting process, which is essentially a site plan review, require details to help control traffic. So at some points there will be, a traffic officer there who, is a fully fledged police officer who might be able to keep their eye on it as well. Apotheca, I know, has a security person or a staff person that also watches over the parking lot to make sure that doesn't get super congested, and it keeps traffic flowing around the building and on Mass Ave, which in that area can be very congested, particularly at peak travel times. So there is also an official adult person out there that could be like, hey kids, like you can't be here, which is probably not their job, and maybe they wouldn't say, hey kids, you can't be here, but there is like an official adult person that is employed by Apotheca that has to follow all the rules and regulations that the state and the local government has put upon that dispensary. And I'm sure that person would not want to endanger any of the permits by allowing children or young adults to enter into the shop.
Mm-hmm. So Patricia wanted to know if there's an age limit to buy from the shop, and I think we're pretty clear in saying it's 21, right? So I think we can tick through that. That's quite clear. I guess I want to jump back to a question that Fred had, which was to discuss the costs of cannabis testing compliance. From a grower point of view, costs of analysis are prohibitive. And I don't quite understand, but are prohibitive discovers small growers. In other words, I think what Fred is getting at, and Dianna, you can maybe help me parse this out, is sort of how do I get into the growing side of this? I'm not sure I know what cannabis testing compliance is exactly. Does one of you?
So there are tests required by the state, and this is interesting because when I first started in this world at my previous employer, we were testing a small part of, I think it was 100 pounds of cannabis. That's a lot of flower. We call it flower. That's the cannabis plant that has been cured and treated and dried. Okay, so 100, you could just take a small sample from that, and 100 pounds would pass inspection. Okay, but then suddenly it went down to 10. So now 10 pounds are tested and 10 pounds go. So the testing has gotten more rigorous, even in my small time in cannabis. I don't know how much it costs. That's interesting. I don't know what that answer is. I don't think it's prohibitive. I think it's more about the amount that's tested and all the dispensaries that are tested and 2 testing agencies. I know that the major one that's in Framingham has put on a 3rd shift for testing. So I think if the cost is not so much in money as it is in time. Now, growing, adults in Massachusetts are permitted a number of plants. It's been a minute I've looked at it. I think it's 6, 12 per household, that kind of thing. That's not enough to supply anybody, except that's personal use or medical use. So it's a whole different standard, a whole different set of regulations to become an official grower.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. A couple of quick questions before we put it in the ditches. Mary wants to know, is there any data on the relationship? Are there any data on the relationship between dispensaries and reduction in the black market? Anybody know of any data? My guess would be, that it's more in view, and that means there's less. My anecdotal experience tells me it's more available, is sort of over the counter, so there's less under the counter.
No, I don't believe that's true. I'm not positive about Massachusetts, but I understand in the West, the black market is, because there's so much saturation of the regulated market, that the prices are low. There's a rabid across state lines black market. So you'd want to think that regulating it would reduce the black market. I wish it were true. I don't believe it's true. Now, this is not Massachusetts. We are regulating and keeping the levels quite sane, so we may be able to avoid some of the pitfalls that the West has experienced.
I gotcha. And then Striper Flies asks, how does Arlington allocate the 3% tax to the town? Erin, that sounds like it's your area of expertise. How does Arlington allocating that money?
So I believe it just goes back into the general fund, but there are certain areas that it can be used on, which relate to education around the use and other aspects. But I'm not 100% sure of that answer right off the top of my head right now.
Let me say one thing sort of generally as we think about winding up this evening, which is that it occurs to me that Apopka is sort of has come into being and is obviously thriving, but in this very peculiar moment that we're living in, right? Where just the amount of travel and the amount of retail activity and foot traffic is so dramatically reduced. So one of the things I'm thinking about as we're planning to say farewell is that it is even more important for all of us to be thinking about the role that these dispensaries are going to play in our lives in terms of their medicinal and recreational benefits, but also that ancillary effect that Cindy is tracking, which is my kids are, I don't think they've ever seen Apopka just because, again, of COVID and limited, but when there are 2 and then 3 dispensaries, it's going to become even more prominent and obvious that cannabis is something that adults use. And it's going to be that much more important for all of us who have kids and care about kids to be thinking about how to have those conversations. Because I think we can all agree that, at least the way I feel, is I'm delighted that there's a dispensary in town. But also as the parent of 3 kids, a couple of whom are teenagers, I feel that sense of, okay, well, this does change the messaging and how clear and obvious it is that the adult world has said, yep, this is something that is done. And it will necessitate us being thoughtful about making sure that we have conversations that maybe 5 years ago we wouldn't have, or at least we wouldn't have at an earlier age. So I'm grateful to all of you guys, Dianna, for kind of demystifying the process inside the dispensaries with such grace and good wit, and Erin kind of taking us through the town's perspective, and Cindy as well, really kind of talking us through the risks that exist. There are all these benefits, but there are also very real risks. And I'm grateful to all of you guys for being able to kind of demystify this new landscape that we're in and going to be moving through even more pointedly in the years to come. So thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.